Friends, welcome back. We're delighted to have with us today Professor Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at International Christian University in Tokyo. He is also a distinguished fellow with Canada's Asia-Pacific Foundation and holds fellowship positions with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Japan Institute for International Affairs. I suggest following Professor Nagy on Twitter to keep abreast of the latest in the Asia Pacific. His Twitter handle is at NagyStephen1. So that is at Mark, NagyStephen, the number one. Additionally, Dr. Nagy provides commentary for a wonderful Clubhouse room focusing on the Indo-Pacific. I highly recommend downloading the Clubhouse app and joining this room. The Clubhouse room is called Geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific and Japan's Regional Role. Professor Nagy, welcome. It's good to see you again.
Good to be back, Ted, and thanks again for having me. I loved the discussion last time.
Well, wonderful. The 2021 Liberal Democratic Party leadership election in Japan will be held this Thursday, September 29, to elect the next president of the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. The winner of the election is expected to become the next prime minister of Japan. 3 of the 4 candidates appear to be receiving the most coverage in the Japanese media. I'm referring to Mr. Kono Taro, the Minister for Administrative and Regulatory Reform, Mr. Kishida Fumio, a former foreign minister, and Ms. Takaichi Sanae, a member of the lower house representing Nada's 2nd district. They appear to be getting the most attention in the press and polling the strongest. Can you tell us a bit about each of these 3 candidates and what their strengths and weaknesses are?
Right, Ted, thank you very much. Yes, it's a consequential election for the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. Depending on who they choose, the party could move in a somewhat more radical direction in terms of leadership, in terms of style, and in terms of communication. But that being said, I think that amongst the 3 candidates that the decision will be made within the party. And I think that's incredibly important for us to be thinking about rather than a general election. And within the party, what we see is that the LDP policymakers and those that are voting really seem to be favoring in a 2nd round vote, Mr. Kishida. And I think this stems from his background in terms of being the longest serving foreign minister under, I think, the most successful prime minister, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. When he stepped down from that position, he took on the role of what we call the chairperson for the Research Policy Council for the LDP. And this role is really critical in terms of working with all the factions. So he had to find ways to compromise with all the different political factions within the LDP to produce policy. So it's a really important skill to demonstrate your communication skills, your ability to form consensus within the party, and the importance of understanding the party dynamics and the politics there. So he has not been overtly supported by the former Prime Minister Abe this time around, but their previous relationship, and I think their track record together suggests that they would, former Prime Minister Abe would be happy to have Kishi as Prime Minister. Now, again, his strengths are his experience as foreign minister. He's seen as a capable policy maker, a capable communicator, and again, he's adept at working with the factions. I think that when we're looking at perhaps his weaknesses, some commentators say that he's not a decisive decision maker, and I think that criticism is a little bit over the top. In Japan, decisive decision making doesn't happen in public; it happens through consensus-based decision making. So, if you can build consensus, you're a better place to actually formulate policy. I think an up-and-comer is Takaichi Sanae, and she has been explicitly supported by former Prime Minister Abe. She's seen as more conservative than the former Prime Minister, and she's voiced her support for visiting Yasukuni Shrine while Prime Minister. Just last week, she called the President of Taiwan, President Chai, to talk shop, which I think is unprecedented because Japan has a one China policy. And despite the rhetoric that Japan would, fight for Taiwan and that its relationships are lip and teeth or they're like family, but Japan's very realistic about its long-term interests within the region, and that means having a fruitful trading relationship with China and hopefully the status quo with Taiwan. Other, I think, aspects of Takeichi, she has put together quite a forward and explicit set of policy proposals. And in the tete-a-tete that we just had last week, she came off sounding a little bit more credible because she was so detailed in her policies. And I think that was an explicit strategy because while Kono and Kishida are trying to minimize mistakes so that they can maximize the support within the LDP, Takeichi and the other woman, Nodo Seiko, they have to stand out. They have to find ways to stand out within the LDP and within the general public. So my view is that she comes across as an articulate, credible speaker. She has less experience within the party machinations than Kishida and Kono. And I think that she'll have problems pulling in women in a popular vote and within the LDP. And that speaks to some of the problems within Japan in terms of gender diversity. The last person you mentioned is current Minister of Regulatory Reform, and who has been charged with the vaccine distribution. That's Kono Taro. Now, he's very popular with Western media, and that doesn't mean he's that popular within the LDP. And I think we should be very careful about how we articulate his position. He's seen as a smart, thoughtful, articulate man, but doesn't have the skills with building consensus within the LDP. And that, again, is a really critical skill to be successful within the Japanese political sphere, being able to build consensus within the party, within the factions to build and create policy. And that, I think, is his strength in terms of being outspoken and a bit of a maverick, but it's also his weakness in terms of being a successful candidate for president of the LDP and potential prime minister.
In your view, what is the likelihood that there will be a runoff election?
So we have 4 candidates right now, Kono, Kishida, Takeichi, and Noda. And what we're seeing in terms of the votes moving up to Thursday is that it looks like the vote's going to be split. So Kono, the popular candidate amongst ordinary citizens, seems to, he probably won't get enough votes to win in the first round, which means that they're going to have 2 rounds. In the second round, we've already seen one of the factions, the Hosada factions, say that they're going to support Kishida in the second round. So I think that it's very likely we'll see a second round, and we're very likely to see Kishida, I think, come through. But there's always a chance for surprises. And again, I think Takeichi represents a potential black swan in terms of changing the dynamics. But I think realistic voters within the party understand the challenges that she would face as a prime minister and how it potentially would cause problems in terms of successful policy. And the LDP right now has had, I think, a tough year with COVID, with indecisiveness about state of emergencies. And the public is really looking for a competent, stable, decisive prime minister. And I'm not sure they're willing to take a chance on somebody that's really doesn't have the track record that Kishida or Kono has.
Soon after Japan's new leader is chosen, there will be a general election to be held sometime by November 28. In addition to issues involving COVID, what are some of the other topics on voters' minds?
So there's a great division, and this is a fascinating discussion in itself, because on the platforms of the various candidates for presidential position within the LDP, they've talked about changing the law so that we can have a female empress rather than a male-only empress. They've talked about visiting Yasukuni Shrine or not visiting Yasukuni Shrine. And they've talked about constitutional revision. Now, quite honestly, these are not the ordinary issues that ordinary Japanese people are interested in. These are positions within the party to get credibility as a conservative. For ordinary Japanese citizens, they want wage increases. They want to see their property prices increase. They want to see their health care and their pensions be secured. I think they would like to see a tax reduction. I think that they're looking for relief from COVID and for the government to address some of the growing social economic inequality that has emerged, not just in the COVID pandemic, but over the past decades. And I must say on that, that this is a really challenge for policymakers, because I think policymakers themselves understand the incredible need for Japan to be a little bit more unequal, to drive entrepreneurship, to drive innovation, to make people not bet all their money on joining a big company and working for that company until they retire. But there's a real sense that Japan needs more entrepreneurs. They need more innovativeness. They need more small and medium-sized enterprises, and that can't happen unless if there's not a little bit more social economic inequality in society, where people have to take a chance and have to take a risk. So here, I think voters, they're concerned about security, but I think over the long term, they're probably going to be more focused on a leader that's going to provide further assistance for daily life, social welfare programs, and stability. Stability is really critical in the Japanese mindset, and I think voters are looking for stability moving forward. And that goes back to my point about why I think Kishida is likely to be the next prime minister, because he ushers in stability and predictability, highly valued and sought after criteria for the voters in Japan.
President Biden recently announced a new security partnership between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, which we're calling AUKUS, focused on the Indo-Pacific region that includes the sharing of nuclear submarine technology with Australia. How does Japan view this development? And more broadly speaking, how does Southeast Asia view that development?
Great question. So I think for Japan, they see the AUKUS agreement as being a significant force multiplier in terms of providing security to the region and ensuring that the region doesn't really reconfigure along an Asian regionalism with Chinese characteristics. So being less transparent, being less rules-based, not abiding by human rights. So I think Japan is very happy about this. But we need to drill down into the sub-agreement in terms of thinking about what does it mean in terms of security. So these technologies, nuclear submarines, really are a deterrence capability. So they have a long-term capability to remain submerged, and they would likely remain submerged in the South China Sea and in between the first and second island chain. So the first island chain is the Philippines, Taiwan, Okinawa, the Japanese archipelago, reaching up to the Sakhalin Islands. So remaining submerged, and if God forbid there was some kind of aggressive or accidental conflict within the region, that those subs would act as a deterrence against a potential enemy or aggressor. And I think most are thinking about China. But beyond that deterrence capability that Japan is very much interested in, because they're on the front line of Chinese assertive behavior in the East, South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits, that I think they also see it as a real commitment to intelligence cooperation, technological cooperation, academic exchanges, and just long-term and deep engagement amongst these three countries. And it'll bolster Australia's position to be much more independent vis-a-vis China. And we should always remember that, Japan has a very strong relationship with Australia, and it will likely sign a defense treaty next year. So Japan will benefit from this. Southeast Asia views this differently. And I think that ASEAN, the organization of 10 Southeast Asian countries, worry that this will remove ASEAN's centrality from the region's integration, that the decisions of the region moving forward, that ASEAN would be kind of the guide, the driver of regional integration. But when we take a more granular look at the Southeast Asian countries, I think they're happy. Some are happy about what this means, because it means that the United States and its closest allies are bringing more deterrence capabilities to the region in a more institutionalized fashion. So the Philippines and Vietnam, these countries are not necessarily celebrating this back in Hanoi or Manila, but I think they understand it as a much more committed and robust layer of protection within the region that can push back against how they understand China to be an assertive power within the region. But others like Singapore, Malaysia, they are a little bit less supportive of these kinds of initiatives, because up to now, Southeast Asia has really been a non-nuclear zone. And the fact that these nuclear submarines will be introduced into the region, even though the Australians don't hold nukes, for some, they feel that this is perhaps the first step towards nuclearization of the region. And this is something that nobody really wants within the region.
While the AUKUS partnership involved Australia canceling its $66 billion submarine deal with France in exchange for a new deal to provide nuclear submarine technology to Australia, Professor Nagy, I'd be interested in your views on this. Is there still not a need for French conventional submarine technology in the Indo-Pacific? In other words, do you think the French have a role to play in providing their submarine technology to states like the Philippines or Vietnam, maybe Indonesia, each of whom have under-equipped navies and who have their own issues with China? And could the Quad maybe provide some sort of financing mechanism to provide French subs to these countries?
That's a lot of questions to unpack. So I think the first reason why the nuclear sub option was taken by Australia was simply is that these are much more sophisticated technologies that are better equipped for what I think the United States, Australia, and the UK understand is the real challenge in the Indo-Pacific, the maritime domain. So being able to provide, the most sophisticated deterrence capabilities through nuclear submarines. And with that, I think that it was the right choice. It should have been communicated better by the Australians to the French. And that leads to the next question. So what kinds of technologies do Southeast Asian countries require to build deterrence capabilities within the region? So here, I think that any kind of deterrence capability is good. Is the French submarines the best choice? Remember, there's Japanese submarines, there's German submarines, and I think that this week we've heard a lot of noise from our French friends, but the question is this just crocodile tears? Let me just remind you that 5 or 6 years ago, when the Australians were competing, or the Japanese and the French and the Germans were competing for the Australian contract, the Germans fell out, and right to the end, it was neck and neck with the Japanese and French. And there was some underhanded ways that the French got the contract. So I think we should be careful about how we characterize the French position. Their technologies are needed within the region. The question is can they be afforded by Indonesia, the Philippines, or Vietnam? And I think that there's really open questions there in terms of, can they afford it? Second, what kind of deterrence capabilities could these subs provide? And third, would they be synergistic with existing capabilities? I think that's a lot to think about for Southeast Asian countries. And you mentioned the Quad, and Quad in terms of financing subs. So I think the Quad has moved in a fundamentally different direction. I think the Quad is moved towards the provision of public goods. And those public goods include vaccine development and distribution. And that's going to be front and center during the COVID pandemic. It's going to continue to focus on infrastructure connectivity, some maritime domain awareness activities. And we've seen that with, for example, the Sea Dragon 21 exercises in January last year, or the Quad countries joining the France's Peru's exercises in April. But I think you should think about the Quad more and more about providing public goods to Southeast Asia. And that's not necessarily security public goods, but helping build better institutions, improving governance, improving health, infrastructure development, and supporting all kinds of ways to further institutionalize the region through norms and values and kind of this idea of a rules-based process.
This past Friday, on the 24th, the US Justice Department reached a deal that released Huawei's CFO, Meng Wanzhou, from Canadian authorities in exchange for acknowledging her role in a fraud case. And hours later, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that two Canadian nationals who had been in prison in China since 2018, the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, were released and returning to Canada. Professor Nagy, do you see this in any way as allowing for a reset in Canada's troubled relations with China? And then secondarily, do you think this will help possibly somewhat lower the temperature in US-China ties?
So it's a real celebration that Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been finally released after more than 1,229 days in Chinese detention. And the timing was within hours of the announcement of Ms. Meng Wanzhou being released from Canadian authorities. And it really sends the strongest signal that the Chinese did have a political motivation for arresting both Kovrig and Spavor, and that they wouldn't have budged from their position until Ms. Meng was released. So I think it's a wake-up call for Canadians. I think it's also a wake-up call for any middle powers and friends of the United States that China understands that hostage diplomacy and these kind of bullying tactics work. They work in terms of getting their nationals back, in terms of pressuring friends of the United States. And they will do it again. And we should be very clear. There's many Japanese still in detention in China. There's Australians are in detention in China. There's Vietnamese in detention in China under similar auspices. So I think the initial post-mortem of this tragedy is that Canada needs to have a much more sober approach to how it deals with China. At the same time, it needs to engage in China. China will be, I was speaking to a friend the other day, over the past 300 years, 300 million Chinese have either killed themselves or been killed in wars, and they're still here. And in the next 100 years and 200 years, China will still be here. And it will be the biggest economy in the world. It will be influential. Canadian policymakers understand that we must have a proactive relationship, a positive relationship, a constructive relationship with China. At the same time, we need to call it out on human rights infractions. We need to protect our interests. For example, our interests in Hong Kong with more than 300,000 Canadians there, and our interests in supply chains and the sea lines of communication throughout the region, which are really being challenged by Chinese behavior under Xi Jinping.
On the 22nd of September, Taiwan applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. This took place less than a week after China announced it had also submitted an application to join the trade bloc. Two questions for you, Professor Nagy. Number one, the CPTPP was initially created by the US to counter China's influence, although the US ended up withdrawing from the agreement under former President Trump. Is the trade bloc's goal still to counter China's influence, or has the promise of the riches associated with Chinese trade overridden this original objective?
So, Ted, so the TPP, and let's just say TPP, it's so much easier.
Yeah.
It was initially founded actually by Southeast Asian countries. And then Australia saw the merit of it. And when Japan jumped in, it became something important, right? This economy of 125 million middle-class people. And at that point, the United States said, let's get on, right? Let's get on the train. So the United States wasn't the founder of this agreement. They kind of joined it. And I think this is probably one of the reasons why they left it. The United States is a trade deal maker, not a trade deal joiner. So I think that when we think about why China has applied over the past week, and then Taiwan applied, China wants to send the strongest signal to the region that on the one hand, it wants to engage in trade. At the same time, they want to send a very strong message to the region that Taiwan better not get into the trade agreement. So likely what we're going to see is China's application will be denied because it has problems with labor standards, problems with environmental standards, problems with intellectual property right. But most crucially is the role of state-owned enterprises. Under Xi Jinping, the role of state-owned enterprises have been strengthened, not weakened. And the TPP, one of the chapters, really stresses the need to eliminate state-owned enterprises from the economy because they shape and they warp how trade works. So it's unlikely that China is going to get in, frankly, because many of the countries don't want them in it, but also because they just don't meet the basic standards. So what about Taiwan? I think on paper, Taiwan meets all the standards of the TPP. The problem is that some of the current members of the TP, Malaysia, Brunei, perhaps Vietnam, perhaps Singapore, they are in China's backyard. And China could perhaps pressure them to prevent Taiwan's application from moving forward. That's the likely scenario because anytime that Taiwan joins an international organization, it legitimates its position as a, excuse me, as an independent entity of some kind. And that's something that China works very, very hard in its foreign policy to prevent any kind of inclination that Taiwan is anything but a province of China. So it's complicated, but I don't see China's application moving forward. And I do see potential for Taiwan to move forward incrementally.
This past Friday, on September 24, the Quad leaders met at the White House, where they reiterated their call for a free and open Indo-Pacific. How do you assess the September 24 Quad summit? And what do you think is the current state of the Quad? And lastly, are there any weak links or particular problems that you see with the Quad?
So I think it's very significant that Prime Minister Suga, Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Morrison, and President Biden came together in the White House for a Quad meeting. This is the first time that the leaders have come together and focused on their vision for the Quad moving forward. And the readout of the Quad meeting was very, very significant. They talked about some really core issues that this region is looking at. They focused on peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. They focused on East China Sea. They focused on the South China Sea. They talked about open trading systems, rules-based behavior. These are all really critical areas that they want to focus on. But at the same time, the Quad members touched upon what they're going to do to provide public goods to the region. And they reiterated the fact that they want to provide vaccines to emerging countries. And that means helping India produce vaccines and then distribute those vaccines to emerging countries. They talked about infrastructure connectivity. They talked about the cyber domain. They talked about open sea lines of communication. And they also talked about an environmental initiative. So next year, there's going to be an environmental conference in Australia where leaders will come together and talk about some of their environmental initiatives so that emerging countries within the Indo-Pacific region can start to build environmentally sustainable economies. And that's really important because it demonstrates the Quad is looking at the region, not just in terms of security, but what are their needs? How can they strengthen them? And by strengthening, for example, Southeast Asian countries individually and as a group, or South Asian countries individually as a group, they can help them be more strategically autonomous. And that means they can make more interdependent decisions about their security and about their trade portfolios and how they engage in foreign affairs within the region without feeling the heat from their major trading partner, China. So I assess it quite positively. And what's interesting is that they also mentioned how it complements the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the United States, and the UK. So they are complementary organizations rather than competing organizations. And I think that's important for us to understand.
Lastly, 2 questions about Japanese food, if I may.
Sure.
So we're now in late September, and I think maybe various fish are now in season, sanma, maybe katsuo, but also other foods that Japanese typically eat in the autumn, yakiimo and oden. So I wanted to ask, what are you and your family eating now that fall has set in, and has your routine changed, or is it pretty much just the same?
So the dreadful heat and humidity of summer is gone. So that means that we can start wearing jackets and go outside more and enjoy nature. So that's one of the great things about Japanese fall is that it's really mild, it's long, and you can just spend hours and hours in parks enjoying yourself. So in terms of food, I think as you mentioned, samma and saba. So that's mackerel. Different kinds of mackerel are very popular in this season, and it's a wonderful fish that you grill, and it's quite an oily fish that has distinct flavors. Pumpkin is in season during this season, so a lot of things are made with pumpkin, and that's really, really wonderful. And of course, the fish is just wonderful. So in our house, we eat a lot of grilled fish, fresh fish during this season, just because it's just so tasty and it's light and it's easy to cook. So that's some of my favorites. And I'm getting ready for things like it's called oshiroko, and it's sea bream, which is also really, really tasty. I think your listeners can research it and they might be surprised what it is.
Okay. So follow-up question, what is the state of curry in Japan now? And by that, I mean, I know it's a strange question, but have the eating habits of youngsters in Japan changed at all in recent years? Because when I studied in Tokyo some 20 years ago, my classmates and I, we kept our expenses under control by eating curry early and often. As a result, I'm addicted. But are high school and college students, are they still eating curry as much as they used to, or have they transitioned to other things? I don't know, Mossburger or something else?
No, at university cafeterias, and if you go to sports camps, kendo camp, rugby camp, curry is a staple. Big bowl of rice with a whole bunch of curry and some meat. The university students love it. I think it brings back memories for many, many people about friends, about sports, about summer camp. And it's just tasty. So I think junk food is popular everywhere, but those staples like kare rice, which is what you had when you were here, is so popular. And I think it's here to stay.
Well, all good news. Long live curry, long live chicken katsu curry, in my opinion. But it's wonderful. Well, Professor Nagy, I know you have many commitments and that you are very busy. So I really appreciate you taking the time for this very enlightening interview.
Thanks, Ted. I think this kind of discussions are really, really important, and I encourage people to reach out. And if they do have questions, they can contact me. And get in touch, use webinars, use Clubhouse, use Twitter, be proactive learners about the Indo-Pacific. And I think you'll be better for it.
Thank you again.